Okay, so we're going to look at, we left off in class, we were talking about agility, and we kind of talked about some of the properties of agility that need to be looked at, you know, some of the stresses that are placed on the body, the biomechanics associated with it. So we left off, I don't think we got to testing yet. If we did, I'm just going to talk about it again anyway. But we have to make sure that in testing, you want to make sure you're looking at all your different qualities, because some athletes may be a little bit more adept, and we're going to go through like a practical example of some things in class to kind of go through, you know, looking at comparing athletes and different qualities and kind of seeing maybe how we can adjust their training accordingly. So we've already talked about reactive agility tests. Again, it's important to do something where they have to respond to a stimulus to kind of assess their ability to do that. And also then different types of change of direction speed, which, as we know, there's different tests that look at different qualities. So in essence, total, we look at kind of recommending 3 different types, okay? So either 1 or even possibly 2 high or low velocity entry changes in direction, which would be your pure change of direction speed. Then you'd also want to look at testing, look at where you're doing a change of direction test that requires maybe 3 or more changes in direction, which that looks a little bit more at maneuverability, and then also including a reactive agility test. So if you really want to kind of encompass all of those different things within agility, you really need to kind of make sure that you can kind of address all of those different things. And again, all tests are going to test different physical qualities. So make sure, again, you're not just randomly picking, you know, tests and drills to do, but make sure that you're picking ones that will address those specific things. And again, look at speed of change of direction. Again, also, you know, assess the position of the athlete as they're changing direction, because that can tell you a lot regarding their, you know, their strength levels, maybe what type of contraction is maybe lacking for that particular athlete. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at agility. So here's some examples of some different tests. So again, you have your low velocity turns. An example of that would be a modified 505. So again, kind of check out the different tests. Your book has some pictures of these, so you could kind of see how these would all work out. So that would be an example of a low velocity turn. So a high velocity turn would be the traditional 505 plus the pro agility, which requires both low and high speed. So really, when you look at low velocity versus high velocity turns, you're essentially looking at how much of a run-in distance do you have before you have to change direction. And then with maneuverability, you're looking at, again, multiple changes in direction. So the L run, 3-cone agility, I would even put the T test in there. Those would all be some specific examples of things that you would want to do to test all of your different qualities. So again, force application, so Newton's second law becomes really important here. So again, if you remember Newton's second law, the acceleration of a mass is directly proportional to the force that's applied. Force equals mass times acceleration. So the angle one pushes into the ground can't compromise the ability to overcome gravity. And it's important to cue the athlete to push or drive into the ground. So again, they need to be able to apply force. They need to be able to apply it in a direction that's going to be able to create the most efficient change of direction. If the braking or pushing off is done too aggressively, they may actually exceed friction and slip. So they have to watch how they're putting their ground. So again, concentrate on having them push the ground away from themselves when they're stopping and braking. So force application and body position. So again, they have to mind their center of mass. Again, if their center of mass gets too far out of their base of support, they're going to lose their ability to kind of stabilize themselves. So the position of the athlete will dictate if triple extension can be used as prime movers during deceleration, change of direction, and then acceleration. So that triple extension becomes very important. They want to have their trunk slightly upright when they're doing this. This is why having a strength foundation is so important when doing agility drills. So strength becomes a very important stimulus in being able to make sure that they can be able to have that. So things like, just general strength, explosive power, eccentric strength becomes very important to be able to decelerate appropriately. They also look for a total body lean. Again, make sure they're leaning towards the direction they're trying to shift their center of gravity to, whether that be rearward and forward. And again, they're going to be using triple extension as the muscles that perform that as their primary movers when they're going through this. So again, making sure that they're using the appropriate muscles will be important based upon their body position when they enter and exit their change of direction. Again, force application, body position. Again, they want to avoid force leakage out of any joint. So being able to stabilize and decelerate is going to be important for that. If you add a defender or reaction to the stimulus, that's going to increase ground reaction forces and joint movement. So performing some sort of reactive based thing, and this is why it's really important to make sure that they have a good strength foundation and that this becomes a part of their training, is that when you add that in, so if you think about a game situation, when you change directions during a game, adding a defender actually increases the forces on the joints. So you have to make sure that you consider that as in kind of preparing them for their sport. So physical change of direction is not as specific as perceptual cognitive. So physical skills related to the success of change of direction are transferable. The perceptual cognitive effort is more specific to the sport. So again, if they can do something that requires that reaction time, that's going to further add to the improvement of their skills through their training. So still looking at the concept of force application and body positioning. So in looking at lateral shuffling research, again, what do we find? We find that athletes have a low center of mass, they have a great hip extension velocity, and they have lower hip abduction velocity. Okay, so those are some of the qualities that we find. They also tend to have a more upright trunk entry and exit positions. Okay, so basically you want to make sure, again, that the center of mass is low, which we've talked about with various types of things regarding sport, making sure that they're strong enough to be able to maintain their center of mass as low as possible. That's going to allow them to function a little better, and make sure that, again, from a hip strengthening standpoint, that they're working the correct motions that are involved in order to enhance this property. Okay, looking at cues for agility. So these, when we're kind of coaching athletes up on agility and change of direction, these are important considerations to make sure that, again, when you're giving cues for something, they have to be things that the athletes are going to understand. And what we find is that externally focused attention is better than internally focused. Okay, so in other words, when we're giving cues for agility, we want to focus more on giving them cues with them interacting with their environment versus cues that are focused on their body parts. Okay, so it's not to say that you can't give them internally focused cues. It's just that cues with their environment tend to be better and easier for the athlete to understand. So in other words, an example of an externally focused cue where you're interacting with the environment, telling them to push the ground away from themselves, is an example of an externally focused cue. Okay, whereas again, internally focused would be more on body parts, like bend your knees more, things like that. So that would be something to consider. Again, it's not that you can't give internally focused cues, it's just that they tend to be a little bit better with the externally focused. You also want to look at cross cues. So there's applications to the on-field and weight room when you look at cross cues. So all that is are things that we would typically give, for instance, in the weight room. Okay. So for instance, finish your drive, push through the ground as hard and as fast as possible. So like that's an example of an external cue, but it also is a cross cue because it's similar to something that we would do in the weight room as well. For instance, like, we would, for instance, like when I teach people how to squat, or when we talked about squatting in 245, I talked about, trying to spread the floor apart with your feet. So that's why it would be kind of be like a cross cue, which has kind of applications to both. Then there's visual cues. For instance, like, visual cues while working at agility, such as like pointing towards like their umbilicus to make sure they're keeping their center of mass balanced before the agility drill so that they can react in any direction. So that's something that you can utilize as well. And then kinesthetic cues are used to increase body awareness. So having the athletes kind of learn the edge of their base of support and how far they can put their center of mass outside their base of support using leaning drills. So you kind of have athletes, lean towards their side to see how far they can get before they have to take a step to regain their balance. Because, again, the idea being with balance and center of gravity is that you're keeping your center of mass within your base of support. Obviously, when you're changing direction, it gets a little difficult to keep it exactly in the center of the base of support, but you want to keep it as much in there as you can to be able to maintain your balance when you're going to change direction. So other cues you can look at, again, you have the perceptual cognitive cues. Again, you could have them focus on different regions of the body. And this would be done by, they could watch a video of themselves, possibly, if that's something that you feel can work for the individual athletes. And you could also give scenarios to learn patterns of movement. So you might want to give them the kind of situations, and the situations can kind of fall into, could have two different qualities. They could be what you would call a temporal restriction, which is basically based on the stimulus that they have to respond to, or what you call a spatial restriction, which is looking at the distance that they can move. So again, these are all different cues. You don't have to use all of them, but these are all different things that you could kind of utilize in kind of assisting the athletes with their agility development. Okay, so in looking at progression, so again, we want to kind of consider the training status of the individual. So for the beginning athletes, or those that don't have a fundamental strength base, should remain in beginner level complexity. So again, acceleration, deceleration, change of direction drills before moving on to really highly complex stuff. So again, movement patterns should just be confined to like forward and backward side shuffling movement. Change of direction at lower entry velocity, just because they won't have the ability to kind of control themselves that much more. And then, maneuverability drills, or those that require really sharp changes in direction, then they should really keep the sharp changes of directions out, focus on things that maybe require more bending, because the sharper changes in direction can be a little bit harder. This way here, it kind of helps them kind of develop some just, and looking at all these different drills, it just kind of helps them to be a little bit more technically better. There's also things that you could look at as far as the weight room, some different qualities and things like that you'd want to develop, which we'll talk about as well. So, again, if you're looking at, for instance, youth weight room stuff, body weight exercises to improve explosive strength or power, concentric jumps to a box, those sorts of things. That'll be better for your beginner athletes. For intermediate, again, movement patterns of basic drills plus changing direction at various angles. You can now start to have a little bit higher entry velocity. So maybe even like a more moderate entry velocity in response to even a single stimulus could start to be applied to the intermediate. And then for more advanced, you could look at, combining high velocity sprinting and 90-degree change of direction. So you could start to make the turns a little bit sharper. You could have large degrees of spatial and temporal uncertainty. So we talked about, what spatial and temporal means in the previous slides, and that could also be done there as well. And again, strength training progression should complement. Okay, so the youth versus elite. Again, we kind of talked a little bit about, youth versus elite with your youth or your beginners. More body weight exercises, whereas your more advanced could start to use things like back squats, front squats, things like that would certainly be more beneficial. And there's just even differences in the field work that you would do. So again, the youth would be doing more in the way of in regards to field work. Youth would be doing more just basic body awareness drills and stuff like that, acceleration drills, deceleration drills. Your elite field work, you could start to do some resisted work. You could do stuff with sleds, again, high velocity changes in directions, higher velocity plyometrics, things like that could be done with your more elite or your more experienced athletes. So here's kind of a table that just kind of summarizes, and I kind of talked about this already, but this could kind of give you an opportunity maybe for you to see it a little bit better and take some notes. So you may even want to pause on this slide and just kind of take your time going through and looking at the differences between maybe a beginner, more youth type athlete versus somebody who's maybe a little bit more experienced. What I will tell you is that, again, here we're kind of showing just kind of like a framework. There could certainly be situations where some athletes might have some physical qualities that are maybe a slightly more advanced and some where they have to hold back. For instance, like with your, maybe quote unquote beginner or younger athlete, maybe they have good strength and they've already had experience with body weight exercises, but like the field work, agility work, they're just not there yet. They could use some forms of external resistance then to strengthen themselves. They don't have to be just confined to body weight exercises for that purpose. So, for testing purposes, if I ask questions related to this, I kind of want you to know these categories. But again, just like with everything else, use critical thinking in practice to be able to really apply the information, because in the end, that's going to make your training much more effective and efficient when you're doing it. So in looking at programming, because again, this is in the end what we're really looking at is kind of how we can kind of fit this into the bigger picture. So with frequency, so it's been shown that as little as 15 minutes per day of just dedicated agility training over 3 weeks can result in improvements in agility. So it's really easy to kind of do this and peak it within an annual plan. And again, you could even kind of address, so just small periods of dedicated training could certainly be done with this. I've tended to find that 1 to 2 days a week can even typically be good with this. And a majority of their agility training can be incorporated into skills training. The book talks about being able to use like small-sided games and things like that. So in season, this is a really easy thing to address because many times they'll just get incorporated into their training. The more important thing is to make sure that they don't do their agility under the components of fatigue. Okay, so again, they need to have, there's a heavy amount of neuromuscular activation that needs to be done. So that's important to note that, drills aren't done under fatigue. So make sure that again, you're looking at good quality work here when doing this. So it's making sure that they're able to do these without fatigue. And again, even just some things in the warm up can even be done that can sort of even address some of this as well. So, again, skills training and stuff like that can certainly be used for this. And again, all in all, for the most part, you can usually address this within 1 to 2 days within their training cycle if you're looking at a week's worth of training. So these are your learning outcomes. Again, you could utilize these as your kind of your study guidelines, but again, take a look at this. So again, take a look at that table again, just to make sure that you have that. And if you have any other questions, we'll address some things in class.